the Honorable Nicholas Johnson.
Goodness. That's not your normal response from a broadcasting group to Commissioner Johnson. I don't know how the word got around that I was going to be your formal speaker. I'm not very formal. Matter of fact, you're lucky I put on my commissioner uniform for you this morning. This is what it looks like. It's your standard Midwest model. And not only am I not very formal, actually some people have been kind of bothering me about the mustache and asking about it and all. And so I thought I'd just explain that, see, so many public officials act like bandits but want to look like public servants. That I thought just for fun there ought to be one. Like a public official, look like a bandit. So that's my role. It's such a funky commission anyway. You might as well have some fun with it. And not only am I not very formal, but I'm also not much of a speaker because I've come mostly just to listen to your questions and your concerns. That's one of the things I like to do out here. I don't often make public appearances in LA, but I do try to come out from time to time and talk to people in the industry, generally quietly and often anonymously. And that's where I've found out a great deal of what I know about what the problems are that you confront, and I appreciate those opportunities very much, and this one as well. Certainly I have no suggestions for the great programming format. As some of you know, I hope, I have taken the position that the FCC is not the most appropriate body necessarily to be programming your stations. I'm not sure I want those judgments left to a GS9. And I'm happy to, share with you such feelings as I have about it, but it's certainly not in an official capacity, and even if it were, it's as one of 7, as you probably know. So, lest any of you have any fears to my speaking on behalf of the FCC, let me dash those immediately. All I have is 1 vote and 1 dissent, which seems to panic still a great number of people in the broadcasting industry who are not satisfied to win only 6-1. But in point of fact, there's very little that I could do to you, even if I were so inclined, although I do try to do some things for you from time to time. And basically, my attitude about broadcasting, as in some other things, is pretty conservative. I gave a speech recently in Chicago, some of you may know about, called Why I Am a Conservative, or For Whom Does Bell Toil, in which I addressed the decisions of Bell management that it seemed to me had not only failed to serve the public interest, but had also substantially deprived Bell shareholders of profits they might otherwise have enjoyed in the millions of dollars. And the response of the telephone company, as one might guess, was that I should henceforth disqualify myself from ever again speaking out on matters involving the telephone company in view of the fact that anyone who was trying to increase the return to shareholders obviously had a manifest bias against the interests of Bell management. So these views of many broadcasters are shared by other industries that we regulate, but basically in that speech I simply explained that all I'm trying to do really is to make the free private enterprise system work. That's supposed to be a pretty conservative doctrine. Matter of fact, I've spent most of my time in government, first as a maritime administrator and now as an FCC commissioner, trying to preach the conservative doctrine of free private enterprise competition to a group of hostile American businessmen who are prepared to applaud the concept at the Rotary Club luncheon, but are appalled at the prospect of its moving in next door. And the other conservative bias of mine is in favor of that political philosophy of a 200-year-old landed aristocrat, very conservative fellow named Thomas Jefferson, called democracy. And what I want for America is not a substantive program of my own. It's whatever will come out of the use of that process. As Lawrence Ferlinghetti has said, I am still waiting for someone to really discover America. I think it's here. And what I'm trying to do is remove the repression, remove the inhibitions to competition, remove the restraints on artistic freedom, and then let happen whatever happens. And whatever happens is what I want. It's as simple as that. Now, I can understand how in an age when our government is dominated by radical liberals, such conservative ideologies as I possess would be somewhat unsettling to them. But I hold steadfast to my conservative positions nonetheless and move on. I have the impression that some of you have heard about me from sources other than Broadcasting Magazine by your response. But as someone pointed out, the audience is mixed, and I detect that there are some here who may not read Rolling Stone. And I really, I don't, I'm not defensive really about this, but I think that since those who do get their information only from broadcasting have mostly misinformation, it might be useful to take a few minutes to explain some of the things that I have been doing on the Commission that I think are in the industry's interest and also in the public interest, because I think the two do coincide very often. On the occasions when they do not, I'm going to take the public interest stance as best I can perceive it, but I think more often than not the two coincide, particularly if you take the long-range interests of the industry as distinguished from the quick buck. Certainly in the free speech area, the WUHY-FM action by the FCC, this whole crusade, this I think repressive, intimidating effort to control the content of the mass media of this country, which is done obviously in the name of obscenity, in the name of stomping out drugs, and so I mean that's the way you do it. You don't come right. I mean, like when the Russians came into Czechoslovakia, they said very much the same thing that we're getting now. They said, now look, we're not interested in censoring, mind you. See, we don't believe in censorship. It's just there are all these folks standing around on the streets talking about dangerous things, and there's some folks on the radio saying things they shouldn't be saying, and it's not in the national interest. But we wouldn't want to censor. Go back and read the Czech Black Book if you haven't read it, all those documents that came out of August 1968. That's the way it happens. But basically, the message that's coming out of out of the administration, it seems to me, when they call in the writers of the television shows and tell them, look, we want anti-pot smoking skits in your series programs in prime time. And they call in the radio and the record people and they say, we want the drug lyrics off of the songs. And they set up an office of a director of communications, which I would point out to you makes us the only nation outside of the communist world to have such a position within the federal government. That a part of what's being communicated is we're keeping our eye on you. And I don't particularly like that. And I've said as much in the WHY case and the KRAB case and this whole exchange with Agnew about the role of music as somehow being the cause of the misery in America. It seems to me it rather is the relief. Broadcasting Magazine, which professes such great support for the First Amendment when it comes to the freedom to advertise, felt that a Pacifica, you know, it's not really free speech, it's profitable speech that they're interested in, actually took an editorial stance opposing the Pacifica stations and their exercise of the First Amendment with regard to programming content, urged the FCC to punish Pacifica for things it had said over the air. Which really shows you where Tayshov's head's at. And I opposed that. I thought it also, you know, the public relations of this industry is just incredible, and I want to talk about that a little later too. But, you know, these guys are so uptight about bombing as a form of communication when it happens to involve people who are otherwise, you know, repressed in their efforts to say what's on their mind. And then when a Pacifica station in Houston gets bombed, you can't find any interest at all in the Justice Department in moving in there and doing anything about it. Now, what is that? I mean, that's an ideological approach to violence, it seems to me. I mean, I don't like bombing of stations. I don't like bombing of anybody's station. I didn't like the bombing of the RCA building. So when they bombed the Pacifica station in Houston for the second time, what does the FCC do? What great investigative force do we think of in Washington that might do something about it? Vince Wazalewski and the NAB. What is this? Huh? I mean, it's like Dean Birch had never heard of the FBI. Finally, Frank Stanton sent a telegram to Attorney General Mitchell, and then, of course, it was all right. Then everybody could get into the act, and now we're all in favor of the Justice Department doing something about it. In terms of the editorial freedom in the news, once again, I've been involved in taking some leadership at the FCC and getting them to calm down over the handling of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where, you know, we had complaints and where we ultimately unanimously found that the industry had not violated its responsibilities in their journalistic handling of those events. The WBBM pot party investigation in Chicago. The subpoenas issue, where support from the FCC was sure slow in coming. Where indeed support from management within the broadcasting industry was kind of slow in coming. I mean, management was all prepared to turn over the reporter's notes. And I gave a speech to the Neiman Fellows in Washington and essentially wrote the appellate court brief for why their lawyers were wrong on the constitutional law principles. CBS got a new set of lawyers, and we recently won the case in the Ninth Circuit. But I mean, that's where management is when it really comes to the crunch. In the area of the technical operation of the industry, I've tried to stand for reduced interference between stations. You got a real problem just listening to AM radio at night, trying to find a station on the dial that's not jammed up with something else. And I say the guys at the FCC who say that, you know, they don't want to have anything to do with programming, I presume that meant because they were interested in engineering, you know, and antenna tower painting and stuff like that. And then along come these requests for waiver, so at this, you know, you waive our rules so the signals can overlap and they vote those through. Or sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and it doesn't seem to have anything to do with mileage, which always leaves me a little mystified as to what's really going on in terms of the recommendations. There again, I've consistently supported a position which I think is in the industry's interest. In terms of planning of communications policy issues generally, I think one can document that the FCC's bungling of the development of UHF in this country, an incredible story. I mean, we started off, see, and we had VHF. And then somebody said, hey, man, that's not going to be enough stations because I just figured it out on the map. What are we going to do? And the guy came back and, you know, a couple years later said, I've discovered something called UHF, see? So then we were going to have UHF television. That took us a while. We got it, and we declared it and everything. And these fellows put up the UHF stations, and they started broadcasting programs. And in about a year, they all went bankrupt. And so he said, wow, that's kind of funny. I wonder why all the rest of them are making so much money. And well, we better investigate. So they investigated, and they found out that the reason why they all went bankrupt was because nobody was listening to the signals because nobody had a UHF receiver, see? Golly, you know, we forgot that. So then they considered mixing it up in the community and unmixing it in the community and mixture and de-intermixture, and we were going to have all the UHF communities and then people would have to buy UHF, see, and they played around with that for a while and they finally gave that up. And then around about early 1960s, somebody said, hey, you know, we've still got that problem about UHF, and maybe what we ought to do is require the sets to be able to pick up UHF. And after some deliberation, everybody concluded that was a really neat idea. So, of course, it takes a while, you know, about 10 years to get the law and then get the sets manufactured and so forth and so on. And so now it's 1970, and we look at the figures, and still, you know, a lot of people not watching UHF and saying, why is that? And they discover, well, it's that tuner, because they don't know how to tune, and it doesn't click into those stations. Golly, I knew we forgot something else, forgot what it was. Now another 20 years is going to pass by while we get the tuners on the sets, see? Now, the public has been disserved, yes. I mean, they have been deprived of alternative programming they could otherwise have had over the years. And that needs to be my principal concern, the sacrifice of the public interest. But I would point out that simultaneously, the industry has lost untold billions of dollars of potential profits it could have made if this program had been started right in the first place. And that this is simply one example, and I could give you 3 dozen, of the FCC's failure to perform in the principal capacity for which it was originally set up, which is as a planning agency. Who else is going to do it for our society? Somebody's got to have some idea of where we're going in terms of communications technology and systems. That doesn't mean we need to dictate it. You know, we can hold hearings, let everybody participate, boot it all over to Congress if necessary, if we don't have the courage to act ourselves. But at least prepare some white papers analyzing what the issues are and what the consequences are and pointing up the alternatives and the benefits and costs of each and making some effort to make an intellectual input to the resolution of these issues. In the area of common carrier service, I repeatedly urged better service for radio, lower rates. I recently took a position urging special rates for broadcasting for wire services, somewhat analogous to what we do for postal rates. One of the principal problems that the broadcasting industry has, I think, is its Washington representation, because Most of what you know about me and most of what I know about you, and by you I mean the people that own this industry, is distinguished from the people who are trying to work with it, is what goes back and forth between the National Association of Broadcasters and Broadcasting Magazine. Now you've got to decide for yourselves as individuals where your best interests lie, and you've got to be prepared, if necessary, to discount everything I'm saying. But just let me lay on you my point of view as to what I think is happening to you in this picture. If it makes sense to you, you think about it. If it doesn't make any sense to you, forget it. But what I think is going on is that there is a multi-million-dollar industry in Washington, D.C., known as trade associations and trade press, whose job it is and whose income comes from keeping you frightened. It is not unheard of for a trade association to send a representative up to Congress, get an anti-industry bill introduced, which they know they can subsequently kill, go out to the membership to raise fighting funds to beat this legislation that's about to nationalize the industry, increase the dues in their expense accounts and their staff, then go back up to the congressman, get the bill withdrawn, and prepare the news release for the membership explaining how much good they've done for them. And think about those full-page ads in Broadcasting Magazine. Did it ever occur to you to wonder why it is a television station in Minneapolis wants to advertise to a country and western radio station in Jackson, Mississippi? What are those ads all about? That's an exchange for basically for inside information and for an editorial policy that keeps you frightened. There are a number of areas. I'm not going to lay all this stuff on you. But we'll take the matter of cigarette advertising. I pointed out early on that it seemed to me the industry's best self-interest would be found in voluntarily removing cigarette advertising from radio and television. Why? Because it was necessarily just or morally? No. Put that aside. Let's just talk about crass self-interest. Like if I were your Washington guy. Because ultimately, if you don't do it, it's going to come about through legislation. And when it comes about through legislation, and you oppose the legislation, what you look like, what you communicate publicly is, we don't care about 300,000 deaths a year that we are profiting from encouraging. We're making money on a death, and we're going to fight to the last ditch to preserve our right to do it. No matter how you present the issue, that's the way you come off looking. And that's precisely the way you did come off looking. And it could have been avoided. And the net result today is precisely the same in terms of the economic impact as if you'd done it voluntarily a few months ago. And had you done it voluntarily, you not only would have avoided the black eye, you would have established yourself as a great, public image, a public concern. And it wouldn't have cost you a dime more. And it would have been worth millions of dollars to you in PR. Or take the industry's stance on the anti-smoking commercials. And this now applies to other anti-product commercials. The industry's response to the anti-smoking spots was to take all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States the argument, at the great profit, let me say, to the lawyers in this business who are a part of this enterprise in Washington. It's not just trade press and trade magazines. There's a separate subdivision of the bar known as the Federal Communications Bar Association that's sending a lot of kids through college on all this too, see. They take all the way to the Supreme Court the argument, which it seemed to me was preposterous on its face, legally, economically, morally, that the First Amendment gives you the right to keep from the American people any information about the health hazards of cigarette smoking. Now, needless to say, the Supreme Court rejected that argument unanimously. There was not a single justice who bought it. Now, I think that could have been predicted ahead of time. But once again, you get the image, you communicate the impression of an industry that's not only hell-bent on profiteering from death, but is trying to keep from people information they need in order to deal with their own health problems, and is willing to make a big fight out of it on the Hill and all the way through the court system. And then you lose. I mean, if you would have won ultimately, it might have been a little bit different. But you lose. So you lose on the merits anyhow. You lose with this incredibly bad image that you get. And you also lose the potential good image you could have had. And, you know, you can go over through issue after issue after issue like this, where I've spoken out time and time and time again in testimony, in speeches, in articles, and opinions, suggesting to the industry, here's another area where your true self-interest lies in taking a little longer look at this than you've taken. Take the whole access question. Question of whether or not the public has the right to come in and utilize the airwaves during some portion of the day. Obviously, you can't put everybody on. Everybody knows that. The question is whether you can keep everybody off. Once again, the position of the broadcasting establishment right now, they're taking this through the court system, is that they have the constitutional right to keep from the airwaves the people who own the airwaves. And I would suggest to you that ain't going to wash. And you're going to go through the same process you went through on the cigarette thing. The businessmen who came to WTOP said, we want to buy time to put on spots opposing the war in Southeast Asia because we happen to think war is bad for business. A minority position, admittedly, in our society. But one deeply held by these gentlemen, and one they wish to portray, and were willing to pay for it. And the position taken by the station was no, they could not buy time for that. Now that case is in the United States Court of Appeals. And so you got, as a result of fighting this, you got the Red Lion decision out of the Supreme Court in 1969, which involved the constitutionality of the fairness doctrine, technically, but which gave the court the opportunity to go on and spell out the access doctrine in a Supreme Court opinion, which again could have been avoided. Now, I happen to think the public interest was served by having the opinion, but that wasn't why the industry got into it. We had the problem with the employment practices of this industry with regard to minority groups. There again, here's an industry that had probably the worst employment record of any industry in America. It was obvious something was going to happen. The Kerner Commission was set up. It was obvious they were going to indict the industry. And the industry didn't move until they did. Could have been avoided. It wasn't. The public posture could have been different. It wasn't. The FCC finally, about 6 years late, enacted some equal employment opportunity regulations. Not that they did it in time, but the point is, even with the slowness of the FCC, the industry didn't respond before the Commission did. And when the Commission did, the industry opposed the regulations. The impact of programming on children, something that had been talked about long before finally Sesame Street comes along, to the great embarrassment of the commercial industry. I mean, you shouldn't have to go to foundations to find the money to do some decent children's programming. That could have been avoided. Now they're scrambling to catch up and not doing all too good at it as it is. Most recently, I've been talking about the impact of commercialism generally on people's heads. You know, what does it do to people if you keep preaching at them, you know, hour after hour after hour after hour, that the only measure of their worth as individuals is their consumption of products? They're measuring up to a model, an ideal, which is not their individuality, but which is a package that is being sold to them by corporate America. What does that do to people's heads? What does it do to people's heads when you tell them that virtually all the difficult problems in human existence can be solved by taking a pill or applying a product to the exterior of your body? You start the morning with the caffeine in your coffee, you go to the nicotine in your cigarettes, you go to the alcohol in your 3-martini lunch, and then you go to your stomach settler, and then your headache pill, and then your compose, and then your pep me up, and then your drink before dinner, and then your sleeping pill before you go to bed. That does more than just sell little pills for the particular manufacturer involved. That sells a gospel. That sells a philosophy. That sells an approach to life. That sells an attitude about yourself. That tells you if you're having personal problems in your life, there's an instant solution. You don't need to think about your own emotional maturity and development, about your own sense of discipline and training and education and perception of the world, about your own willingness to cooperate and compromise and work with other people, about developing deep and meaningful human relationships and trying to keep them in repair. That's DuPont's slogan. Better living through chemistry. Pop a pill. And then the vice president, whose political efforts are sustained by the campaign contributions of the sponsors who are putting those commercials on your station. And the guys who are preaching this gospel has the audacity to say that the whole problem will be solved if only you'll stop playing the records. Okay, a lot of people have been talking about this recently. Charlie Reich is not the only guy that's seen the greening of America. A lot of you are right here. I mean, you've thought through your own lives and you've made some changes. I have. A lot of people have. A lot of people talking about it. I've been talking about it. A lot of people have been talking about the impact of commercialism on this whole process. They've been questioning whether an ever-rising gross national product is the only measure of America's greatness. They've been questioning what it does to our heads to just sell products that we don't need, that appeal to the wrong motives, that are probably overpriced, may very well be hazardous to our health, or are going to break down or otherwise inferior. And whether or not we really want and need an economy and a society, a country that requires the ever-escalating manufacture of such products and the manipulation of consumer demand that is necessary in order to dispose of them and distribute them. See? Now, I don't think that an intelligent response to those kind of concerns requires the dismemberment of commercial broadcasting. Not today, it doesn't. But if you don't do something about it soon, it's going to in the future, just like these other things came true, just like I said they were going to. There is a way of accommodating, I think, there is a way of accommodating commercialism to something as precious as people's heads. You can sell products people need. Maybe you don't have quite as many commercials. Maybe you stop carrying advertising for some products. But there are other products around. There's money to be made. Maybe you can't always make more profit next year than you made this year. But you can make a profit. You can live well. Well, those are some of the things that are on my mind. I like radio. When I was a boy, I made little radio sets. I grew up on radio. I got out of the house before we got a television set. So radio was all I knew, really. I used to listen to shortwave. I studied Morse code. I wanted to be a radio amateur. And I want the industry to do well. I still keep hoping that, somehow we're going to make it. A great many of the things I've been doing at the Commission are directed to that end. We're not always going to see eye to eye on it, but I know it's beneficial for me to hear from you, know what your problems are, know what your reactions are, know what you think I ought to be doing, what the FCC ought to be doing, and I hope that perhaps these few remarks this morning are of some help to you in understanding where my head's at. Thank you.